making evidence usable. So in this next section, we'll talk a little bit about what agencies actually need. So we'll talk about synthesis, we'll talk about actionable options, and importantly, we'll continue discussion around context-aware implications. So first off, synthesizing evidence is key. What do we mean by synthesizing evidence, right? So probably most of y'all intuitively can guess like you don't want to walk into a state agency or just send the state agency staff member a half dozen reports and papers that you've written. You need to synthesize it, right? You need to synthesize that evidence in a way that is meaningful and is tailored to the actual needs of that agency. Agencies do not need individual studies. They generally will discount them heavily, right? Especially if it's a low sample or it's not collected in their state or it was a one-off thing, and they understand that like a single study does not make good policy. They're not going to read long, detailed reports, and they're not really going to draw abstract conclusions that are, or really accept abstract conclusions that are detached from context. If you don't know what's happening in the state policy context and in the communities that you're trying to serve, then what good is this work, right? Is often their feeling. So they need synthesized, right, evidence that has been summarized in a meaningful fashion, that draws across studies, it identifies consistent patterns, and importantly, maybe most importantly, reduces the cognitive burden on those decision makers, state agency staff, state agency leadership across all levels do not have time to sift through the materials you have sent, right? And if you're expecting them to, then you've already lost the battle, right? They want tight, tight, detailed, but not overly complex information that explicitly addresses the questions that they have. And then you can provide additional details and appendix things and things like that to answer questions. But to ask them to sift through it is generally considered disrespectful. Further, you need to provide options that can act on. In the previous sections, we talked about the need to understand the statutory authority, the political realities, right? What leadership wants. Agencies need clear choices on what to do next. That's what they're looking for. It doesn't mean they're going to accept those wholesale, but offering and these ideas of what to do next, they're used to that, right? They have folks knocking on their doors all the time from nonprofits, from advocacy groups, from local communities, from local government, and they're saying, we want you to do this. We want you to do this. They're used to that, right? And so they expect you to make a recommendation, and they need those recommendations to be clear. And only then does all of your science and research and insight kind of come in after the recommendation to support that. Translating those findings into implications for programs and policies and operations that show alignment with the agency's workflows and their constraints, that's what they want. Further, be explicit about uncertainty and limits, but don't belabor it. So, clarity about uncertainty and limitation supports understanding risk management and decision quality. Like these are the type of things that they do want to understand. So, when evidence is presented as synthesis, right, and you've applied it, right, it's going to be more likely to be used in decisions, but what is really key is that you characterize the uncertainty in terms that they can understand and understand it because not understanding that uncertainty, not understanding the limits of the research could pose a political risk, right, or a statutory risk, or ultimately to the failure of the effort. They don't necessarily want to go into the weeds on like the uncertainty that is underlying and being modeled in your confidence interval, for instance. That is not what they're looking for. They want uncertainty in terms of like, this might not work in this population. This might not apply in this type of context. And understanding and characterizing that uncertainty is key. Understanding and characterizing, well, our confidence interval, our 95% confidence interval, was between here, and like we tried to model out some of that. Like they don't want that, right? That's not what they're looking for when I say uncertainty. Excuse me. So, decision-ready evidence is one of the other key concepts that we want to share with folks today. And there's lots of terms for this, but decision-ready or actionable intelligence, right? These are the types of things that our decision makers within state agencies they want. They want evidence that directly addresses what works, for whom, under what conditions, at what cost, and with what implementation requirements. The who, what, where, when, and how to do it, and the dollar signs, right, are key. So these elements, they map onto questions that the decision makers, the state agency folks themselves have to answer. If any of them are missing, then their bosses are unlikely to really, to say, like, let's move ahead. And it forces them to come back to you if they are even that interested and ask those questions. So don't make them ask, right? Show up with it on day one. And if you don't have that information, right, that is part of the science. And so for many of you who may not, for instance, be engaged in different implementation sciences or understand or are interested in sort of the budgetary consequences of things, this is the time, right, to start thinking about your research teams and your collaborators. If you don't know the costs of the intervention that you want the state to use, that's going to be a problem because it's going to be one of their first questions. If you don't know what it looks like to implement your solution in rural communities because you've only done your work in urban spaces, that's going to be a problem, right? And so you need to think about or work with an implementation in specialist or think about what your next study is going to entail to be able to speak to that, or be really upfront, as I mentioned on the previous slide, to be prepared to explain the uncertainty and the limitations of your science, because maybe you don't need to explain what this looks like in rural context, but you can bet that if you don't characterize it in the first go and they have to come back to you and ask the question, it's already reduced the likelihood that they're going to say yes or be interested in pursuing this. So decision-ready evidence does not remove that uncertainty, and that's the key thing. It does make that uncertainty explicit and manageable, helping state agencies be able to describe and anticipate the consequences of moving forward with this work, especially to their political, right, their elected leadership or appointed leadership. So producing decision-ready evidence, though, requires additional synthesis and judgment from you as the researcher before you're even in the room, but it also greatly increases the usability of that work. And it does also increase the accountability, right? Because if you tell them it's going to cost a certain amount or it's going to be successful in these contexts, and it's not, it's going to affect how and in what ways they want to engage with you in the future. But importantly, it also providing this decision-ready evidence can build trust and signal to the state agency staff, to the state agency leaders that you are someone who can be depended on in critical decision moments because you know what they need. And you're not going to show up with, for instance, information that doesn't directly talk about what works and who it works for and under what conditions. And you're not going to leave them hanging. So that's really important. So all of this leads to the idea and the importance of shifting your role. So to work effectively with state agencies, researchers must shift their perceived role from producing research on a topic to actually helping decision makers make better choices. This is a different role. This is a different identity, a different hat. And in order to be successful in engaging with state agencies, you yourself will need to be comfortable with that changing of the hat, that code switching, if you will, right? Because in your lab, you still have to be the researcher who is thinking about all of these elements of rigor and nuance. But when you step into your engagement identity, then you need to be able to sort of switch. And it means speaking differently. It means engaging differently. It is not the same as engaging with your students. It's not the same as engaging with your department head or a colleague. It is a different space, and you are the visitor there, and your success depends on whether or not you can adjust and shift your identity, your role to that context. And that means, again, understanding problems from the agency's perspective, tailoring your information to their needs, and engaging with them as a partner rather than being the distant expert. right? So many of you may have seen or even participated in being called to like give testimony to a legislature or hold a briefing, or you may have even been invited to an agency event where they've invited a researcher, you, to give a talk, right? And talk about your science. That's great, right? And those are great activities, and but that is different than engaging with a state agency in a meaningful fashion that develops long-term, durable partnerships where there's trust and it opens the lines of communications. So it also, though, means being responsive and adaptable as needs change. You can't go and, if you spend 2 months working really heavily on an issue area, if you don't respond to that email that comes a year later, right, when the issue is back up, that is going to close doors for you. So it is a long-term commitment. And I encourage folks, particularly when like researchers leave a university and they're moving to a different state, let your partner at the state agency know that that transition is coming and work to engage with your colleagues or others at the university to kind of take over that partnership because state agencies view a researcher not only as a representative of themselves, of their lab, but also of the institution itself. And when we fail to provide warm handoffs, it's not just you that ghosted them, it's the entire institution as far as they're concerned. And that is not something and not a legacy that you want to leave. Um, the role is not meant to compromise, right, your scientific integrity. That is not what this is about. This is not about reducing the rigor of you as a scientist, but it is about increasing your ability to have impact as a scientist, which means bringing that applied mindset, right, in the service of real world decision makings. And over time, the shift can lead to deeper collaboration. It can lead to co-production of knowledge, and it can allow you to have those more nuanced conversations that you might not have on day one. Maybe understanding that confidence interval is really important. And you can't have it the first time you meet with the state agency, but you develop those relationships and you can bring an understanding of the nuances of that scientific area to such a degree that you can have that. And that's really the golden opportunity is not only the engagement, not only the more effective decisions being made by a state agency, but also the ability to lift up the whole conversation, right? And that's a cultural change and one that for those of you who are really serious about engaging with state agencies in a long-term, meaningful fashion, right, is one to aspire to. So the next skill is focusing on packaging evidence. So translating research for decisions means converting findings into formats that match real decision processes and timelines and are focused on implications that are implications, not the methods, right? So here you can see an example of not what a policy brief, but it's actually a fact sheet is what we often refer to this as. So it's got a front and a back in many cases. Right up front are those key takeaways. You have the authors for transparency right at the beginning of the work, and with as well as some simple branding, but you don't necessarily need tremendous branding. And you need to be careful here too, because putting Penn State branding on these type of things is not always the best strategy. And like sometimes it's helpful, and I understand that folks in leadership are often interested in seeing Penn State branding on things, but sometimes it's better to not have that branding on there if you haven't gone through, for instance, certain approval processes. If you're working in maybe more controversial areas, right? You really want to attribute it to the group that's working on it, for instance. Um, so there should then be, a very quick summary, right? And in this context, we were providing some definition and differences with traditional foster care to kinship care, right? And trying to help a group of policymakers who actually there had been a conversation. We listened to what their needs are, and they requested this document. And so we were quickly trying to provide bullets on what kinship care is and is not and trying to distinguish it from others. You'll see here that what we provided did not necessarily have a long reference list, but what it did have was hyperlinks, right? Hyperlinks back to key information and key resources. This is not necessarily a policy brief that's meant to sit on on a public website as the be all end all of a policy analysis for the end of time. This was to address a very specific question and provide the key facts and considerations for the policymakers who asked for this work, right? So what you can see here is this is very informational, and it's trying to, for instance, highlight the options and trade-offs between kinship care versus traditional foster care. But it's not uh, over kind of emphasizing all of the different details and nuance. This is a very complex area for those of you who work in this space, I'm sure you know, and understanding and contextualizing it in the definitional elements are really key. And then further, keep it lean and clear. Do not give them a wall of text. Use bullets liberally and emphasize and highlight the key areas that need to be addressed.